last week I promised some visual aids. I know some of you are more visual learners, so this will help you remember those 10 commandments that we've been going through now that we finally have our table back. All right. So, what's number 1? Thou shalt have no other gods before me, or don't give anything else more reverence than God. All right, what's number 2? Oh, this one's really at me. All right, no graven images. Do not confine God to any one image. All right, number 3. Do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Be careful how you use God's name. Number 4. Sabbath. There you go. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Remember to take time to remember that you are more than what you do. All right. So what number are we on now? 5. All right. What's number 5? Honor your father and your mother. Honor your parents. Give them the weight of real people. Let them be real people. All right. Number 6. This was just last week, so. What was it? Thou shalt not kill. Y'all stop taking life. And then today, we have, thou shalt not commit adultery. So there we go. So, we will leave this up. We might need to get a bigger table. Yeah, this will stay up to help you remember. All right, thou shalt not commit adultery. I tried to prepare you all by giving you my sermon title ahead of time. All right? Because my guess is that this morning might be the most times that you've ever heard a preacher say the word sex from the pulpit. I don't know what kind of church you grew up in, but it's probably the most times I've ever heard the word sex from a pulpit. And this fact is more unfortunate than it is surprising, right? Because we are conditioned to not talk about sex. But not talking about sex leads to more problems than overcoming our initial awkwardness or our hesitancy to talk about this part of our lives. Because it is a huge part of our lives, right? It is literally why all of us are here today, right? So it is good for us to talk about it. It is good for us to understand how it can both promote as well as prevent us from living into the fullness of life that God desires for us, which is the whole point of why we are going through these holy utterances of God. It is good for us to know that sex is as much about pleasure and procreation as it is about pain and power. There are two sides to this coin. It is good to talk about how it can both strengthen our bonds with another person as much as it can be used to violate those bonds. It is good for us to learn how attraction and chemistry and desire work and are part of who we were created to be. And it is especially good for us to put into practice the power of consent and communication and commitment and care and respect. Things that are often missing from our conversations about sex. It is good for us to talk about it because it is part of who and how God has created us to be. It's important enough that it made the list of top 10 commandments. Granted, it only came in at that 7th spot, but still, it made the top 10 list. But beyond the reference to human sexuality that we find in today's commandment, there is a whole book of the Bible that is nothing but a beautiful exchange of songs between lovers declaring their love and desire for one another. It's a book you probably haven't read or ever heard a sermon about. Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon as it's sometimes called. And I purposely looked to this book for our call to worship. I wanted to set the mood for this morning. So I looked to the Song of Songs, and I have to admit that it was actually hard to find a passage that wasn't too salacious. So you thought this was juicy. Go read the rest of the book. This was just the first 3 verses, because the rest gets real graphic real quick. And it is delightful to read, to find this book tucked away in a forgotten corner of our Bible. And it is sad that we don't hear much from it. The Song of Songs shows us that human sexuality is something to be celebrated, not something to be ashamed about or to be ignored. But in order to celebrate it, we first must understand how it's part of God's call for us to be in right relationship with ourselves and others and God. So here we go. You've been warned. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Or simply put, no adultery, as many translations put it. Now, in the narrowest sense of the word translated here as adultery, this commandment against adultery is about not having sex with someone who is not your spouse. And more specifically, in the patriarchal society in ancient times, it meant not having sex with another man's wife. This is that narrow interpretation that we have been looking at, how we've kind of narrowly defined all of these rules. But even back in the biblical times, the term adultery was used as a kind of blanket term that referred to unfaithfulness or sexual immorality in general. This is a little helpful, but it still begs the question of what is meant by sexual immorality. It's such a general term that we all think we know what it means, right? When it shows up in a scripture verse, we all nod our heads knowingly whenever it's referenced, but we don't stop and take the time to interrogate our assumptions and really find out what it means. So that's where we're going to start today. And the first thing we have to do is we have to change the lens through which we understand or don't understand what sexual immorality means. You see, we tend to approach the idea of sex with a who mentality, right? We seem to spend a lot more time worrying about who is having sex rather than how people are behaving within sexual relationships. We tend to think in these binary terms and spend so much time policing who we think should and shouldn't be having sex, young or old, male or female, gay or straight, married or single, that we neglect having a more useful conversation, a more helpful conversation about what makes for healthy relationships. I would even go so far as to argue that God isn't so much concerned about who is involved as whether or not the relationship brings joy and mutual satisfaction. That is the heart of the issue. I would argue that the God who is love is on the side of healthy, loving relationships. Relationships that are consensual, respectful, honest, and pleasurable no matter who is involved. As always, as we've done every week, it is important to remember the context of these holy utterances. It began with that preamble where God announced these words, saying, I am the one who brought you out of slavery, who liberated you from your oppressors. I am speaking directly to you. This is God speaking directly to the gathered community, showing the people how to live in right relationship with God and with one another. All of these words that we have been going through are words for how to behave. So we need to shift our perspective of sexual immorality from who to how. We need to be less concerned with who is having sex and more concerned with how folks are treating one another within these sexual relationships. So, a prohibition against sexual immorality is in reality a prohibition against destructive behaviors within a sexual relationship that should be as much about giving as it is about receiving. As one scholar put it, they say, most comprehensively, the prohibition points to the recognition that sexuality is enormously wondrous and enormously dangerous. The wonder of sexuality is available in a community only if it is practiced respectfully and with discipline. And the danger of sexuality is that it is capable of evoking desires that are destructive of persons and of communal relations. And as a whole, we do a decent job of emphasizing the dangers of sex, or at least two very particular dangers, right? They are the staples of health classes everywhere. The dangers of sex are pregnancy and STDs. Very good. Yes. Gold star. The staples of health classes everywhere. We do a great job of trying to scare kids away from having sex. But we do them and ourselves a disservice by stopping there and not addressing the importance of consent and communication and care. Because the lack of these things is far more destructive and damaging than any unwanted pregnancy or STD. And that is why Jesus takes this commandment a step further in the Sermon on the Mount that we heard earlier. Jesus quotes this commandment saying, "You have heard the commandment, no committing adultery." And then he takes it a step farther. "But I tell you that those who look lustfully at others have already committed adultery with them in their hearts." Jesus is about addressing the attitude that we bring to these relationships. It seems as though Jesus knows it's not the sex that's the problem, but that people are the problem. The enormously dangerous side of sex is made real when we use and abuse one another, when we objectify another person, and we demand more than what they are willing to give. These are the dangers of sex. So this prohibition against sexual immorality is a prohibition against exploitation, objectification, and abuse. Because that is what inhibits us from entering into the fullness of life that God desires for us. We have to remember that God didn't give these words to the people to restrict their freedoms. This is the God who delivered them from slavery, who set them free. This isn't a list of do-nots made to strip life of all of its fun and its joy. Instead, these words were given by the liberator so that the people could live as a whole into the fullness of what it means to be free. This is how we become free. So just as we do ourselves a disservice by not talking about the wider dangers of sex, we also do ourselves a disservice by not talking about that other side of the coin. We don't focus on the other side of the equation and explore the enormously wondrous side of it, the gift that it is to us. While we teach kids about the dangers of pregnancy and learn the symptoms of various STDs and show them very graphic slides, we spend little to no time learning how to give and receive pleasure. We're not encouraged to explore our desires or taught to ask for what brings us joy and satisfaction. And we're scared to embrace the gift and the fullness of our sexuality and let it bring us joy. We do ourselves and others a disservice. And this is the true shame of our relationship with sex. See, sex wasn't designed to bring us down or make us feel awkward or inadequate. At its best, and at our best, sex brings us together in powerfully and beautiful ways. It strengthens our bonds together. It brings us joy. It teaches us about ourselves and others. I chose this morning's quiet meditation not only to honor the great Toni Morrison who passed away this week, but because she so beautifully captured the hope of being in right relationship with an intimate partner. She says, "Don't ever think I fell for you or fell over you. I didn't fall in love. I rose in it." Engaging in healthy relationships with each other is never about tearing one another down. It's not about falling. It's not becoming less than. It is about building one another up and leaving each other because of it, because of the relationship we have shared and the moments we have treasured together. So, beloved of God, let me remind you that we were created to love and to be in relationship with one another, and that sex is a part of that process, a beautiful and wonderful natural part of that process. So whether you are young or old, male, female, non-binary, queer or not, married or not, understanding and being in right relationship with your own sexuality is part of what it means to live into the fullness of life that God desires for you. And being in right relationship with yourself is also what allows you to be in relationship with others in a way that is not hurtful or destructive or damaging to them. Being in right relationship with yourself allows you to give yourself fully to a relationship. Affirming your own sexuality and respecting that of others is what keeps us from committing adultery. So, beloved of God, remain faithful to who and how God created you to be. I encourage you to take delight in what has been given to you for your pleasure, and to take care of each other as you go. Amen.